Afternoon, and welcome to Action and Resolution of the Hollywood Writers' Strike, presented by the Brown Club of Orange County. My name is Carl Shulkin, and I'm a board member of the club. The idea of our club sponsoring a program focused on the Hollywood Writers' Strike first occurred to me as a result of a conversation I had with a veteran screenwriter and my son Todd's housewarming last summer. Behind the writer recounted his experiences walking the picket line and reminded me that my wife and I knew many of Todd's friends who were on strike. Those friends included several Brown alums and a number of students whom my wife and I had taught at Pembroke Hill School in Kansas City. After hearing their accounts of walking the picket line, we wanted to support the cause and learn more about the issues involved in the strike. Todd kindly agreed to recruit some Writers Guild members to share their perspectives. I'll turn it over to him to introduce them.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. We have a bi-coastal sign up. So while we're an Orange County Brown alumni event, we have some good representation from across the country. And I think all of us panelists are actually in Los Angeles. As my dad said, I'm Todd Shulkin. I'm class of 93. I'm a Hollywood literary manager and producer, and I represent writers, directors, producers, as well as intellectual property. And I've run my own boutique shingle, which is called Shulkin Management, since 2007, after spending 5 years in advertising. And before that, I originally trained as a literary agent at a mid-sized agency called Innovative Artists. So I'm really delighted. We have an embarrassment of riches, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the talent that agreed to join us, of really seasoned Hollywood writers, and 2 out of 3 are Brown alums. And as my dad said, we're going to talk about the reasons behind the recent Writers Guild of America strike, as well as its resolution, and just also maybe contextualizing that all happened against a period of 6 months, maybe more, in the US, where there was a really significant amount of labor unrest, both in terms of strikes or potential strikes and negotiations, which we think is pretty meaningful. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We will do a Q&A at the end. We'll probably talk for about 40 minutes. If you would put your questions in the chat, that would be most helpful. Zoom should have told you, but we are recording. And I think that's it. So let me make the introductions. I'll just go alphabetically. We have a lot of C's as well. So we've got Courtney Kemp, who's class of 1998. And Courtney is an Emmy-nominated creator, showrunner, writer, and producer. Probably best known for the critically acclaimed Starz drama Power, which has 3 spin-off series. Is that right, Courtney? 3? Which I have to say is either a record or near record. The only person I can think of with as many spin-offs is probably the late Norman Lear. Courtney was named one of the Hollywood Reporter's top 50 Power showrunners, Adweek's TV Creator of the Year in 2021, and one of the 50 most influential women in America by Marie Claire magazine. Chris Kaiser is a veteran Hollywood creator and showrunner and a widely respected industry leader, perhaps best known creatively for co-creating the classic hit show Party of Five, one of my favorites, and most recently served as executive producer and showrunner on Max's Julia series, which fictionalized the legendary culinary icon Julia Child's rise to television fame. He served, as why he's joining us today principally, as the co-chair of the Writers Guild of America's 2023 negotiating committee, and he previously served as the president of the WG West from 2011 to 2015. He went to Harvard. We're going to be okay with that for today. I think he also is on that top 50 Power showrunner list with Courtney. And also joining us is my old friend Chris Ord, who is also class of 1993. And Chris has worked as a co-executive producer and showrunner on numerous programs for NBC, the CW, and notably on his own hit show, which was on USA Network, Covert Affairs, which you might remember, all of which he works with his writing partner, Matt Corman, who is also class of 1993, wasn't able to join us today. Beyond TV, Chris Ord and Matt wrote the feature film Deck the Halls, which starred Danny DeVito and Matthew Broderick. They most recently served as co-executive producers and writers on the Marvel series Daredevil for Disney+. Thank you, everyone, for being here on this Sunday, right up against the football game. So I want to start, since everyone presumably is interested in the subject, and that's why they've joined us, with some background. And I thought, Chris Kaiser, you'd be the best person to kick us off, and then I'll ask Courtney and Chris Ord to come in. So why was it, Chris Kaiser, that the WGA felt it was necessary to call a strike?
Sure. Well, maybe a little bit in deeper background than that. The WGA represents writers of film and television. WGA East and West were two separate guilds, but we work together and negotiate together. And we negotiate against the major studios, the AMPTP. And we do that once every 3 years and set what's known as the minimum basic agreement, which sets minimum writing compensation and working conditions for writers. So it's our responsibility to make sure that writers have a kind of a platform off of which they and their agents or managers can negotiate their more specific deals. We don't strike very often. The last time we struck was in 2007 and 2008, when we struck over jurisdiction over the internet, which means that we had the right to apply all of the protections that we have to shows that were written for online. That turned out to be an enormously big deal because so much of what we write is actually online. So we haven't struck since then, and we hadn't struck before that since 1988. So it happens only rarely, and only if the situation suggests that we are at risk of losing more than a strike, which is always a painful thing and always has loss associated with it, can be overridden by what can be gained. So what was at stake here? Things all across the industry. Some people know about a lot of them already. AI was one of them, but we can talk about that later. The risk of AI, the threat that it would take away jobs, or at least change writers' relationship with their creative work. That was one thing. There were issues in features and in the writing for comedy variety shows. But most of us work in episodic television, and most of the issues were in episodic television. I mean, we can get into more detail, but I would say this as a background. The reason why we struck was because the changes in the business that have occurred over the last decade or so, mostly because of the move to streaming, the policies instituted by streamers for short order television shows like the ones that all of us make on this Zoom, they established working conditions for writers where even the good times, even success, made it almost impossible for most writers to sustain a career over the long haul. In other words, we can go through all the details, but it wasn't just that things were bad. It was that things were both bad, but even when they were good, it wasn't good enough to actually sustain a career. I'll give you a brief example of it. People may have heard of this or not. There was a rise of what we called in the business mini rooms where writers would work for 8, 10, 12 weeks and do all of the creative work of the show, much of the creative work of the show, in a very short period of time. And writers are paid weekly for their work. So you get 8 weeks of pay or 10 weeks of pay. You do all of the work, and then, I mean, for example, I don't know if Courtney actually had this on her shows. I didn't, but Courtney, as a showrunner, would then be left with all the work to do for the next year of making the show, and all the writers would disappear, or almost all the writers would disappear. And that presented a dual problem. It meant that for younger writers moving up the ladder, they never worked for long enough or for a high enough rate per week that they could actually sustain this business where most of the time you're not working. For showrunners and people in positions of responsibility, it meant that they worked endless months, sometimes years, to produce things without the help that they normally had from other writers. Television writing is a somewhat communal activity. It's written mostly in writers' rooms, not exclusively, but mostly in writers' rooms through the shared creative energy of a lot of writers. That's also where the knowledge of how to make television is passed from people like Courtney, and I hope me, to other writers and Chris. But when those writers are gone after 8 weeks and aren't there for production and aren't there for post-production and don't get to write very many scripts, No one's passing on the information. So it was for the sake of, I would say, efficiency and productivity on the part of these companies, a move away from the structure by which television had been made the last 50 years that left almost all writers really at risk of not being able to continue their career. And we heard those stories for years beforehand. We did a survey of all of our members to say, what's the business like for you? And they told us the business is increasingly untenable. And armed with all of that, and there's a lot more detail than that, and I'm sure everyone else on this panel can talk about it, armed with that basic idea that the structure of the business had been changed by the companies, we went back into the negotiations in last year to say, we have to put in place structural reforms and safeguards that make it possible for people to earn a living, not just for a short period of time, but for a lifetime.
Thank you, Chris. I'm curious what Courtney, I just want to point out, I did maybe make a mistake in the sense that I've assembled all successful and very successful writers, and we don't have someone represented who is maybe more struggling. But I'm curious from a success point of view, Courtney, even what that felt like for you, or what you would add to what Chris Kaiser said as background.
Well, Chris is really experienced at sort of laying out all the larger issues. And so some of what I'm going to say to you, he's heard me say, and other people have heard me say. But I actually can talk about the kids who don't get to grow and learn. And as Chris Kaiser well knows, one of my big issues during the entire strike was that these younger kids, especially of color, women and LGBT kids, were going to fall out of the business because they get the jobs later, and then they get the jobs in the last, I'd say 5 years. A lot of shows that were focused on those points of view started. All of a sudden, people were getting shows on the air that were more specific points of view. And those shows, by dint of having younger showrunners or early or sort of newer voices, they also had a lot of younger voices in the room. And these were the ones who were getting these pre-green light, sort of 8-10 week, forgive me, bullshit rooms. And so people were not getting the time to learn. And the other thing that, I mean, Chris is not only correct in saying they weren't getting the ability to move up, they also weren't getting any time on set. And so part of what our job is actually to show up and not only write, but produce and become showrunners. And if it hadn't been a vocation, it's a profession, television writing. And if it's not treated as a profession with apprenticeship and people being able to move up, then people like me don't exist. I'm very lucky, but I came from the world of writing where I was the one Black person or the one woman, or sometimes twofer that people would get on a show. And part of that, of course, is because I'm ever true and I got to go to Brown. And so I knew a few people I could sort of get in. But I will say that, I was very lucky to have wonderful mentors, but you can't mentor people in 8 weeks. You can't mentor people in 10 weeks. You don't have that time. So I can speak a little bit to the fact that many of the kids who I raised, and I do think of them as my children a little bit, that I raised over all 10 years of making Power and the various spinoffs, and Dick Wolf has got me by a lot, I'll just say. But I would say is that a lot of those younger kids are out of work, and they're out of work right now. And some of that has to do with the fact that they weren't working in broadcast. They were working for me on Stars, which means they were working for 10 episode chunks anyway. Some broadcast shows actually did go back right away when the strike was over. But I would say also from a position of success, since you asked me, my thing was I was kicked off my deal. My deal was suspended. It came back. I'm very lucky. It was suspend and extend for me. I was very lucky. But so I had to keep everyone on my payroll still paid, but that's okay. I'm in a position to be able to do that. And so I kept everyone paid, and I sort of would give a little money to the writers I knew who were going to be out of work longer. But ultimately, after the strike, the business has shrunk. What people are saying yes to is smaller. What people are saying yes to in terms of rooms, now that the Writers Guild, the new MBA, holds them more accountable to paying people, guess what? They don't want to pay as many people. So now they're really looking at how many writers do you need? It's a different world, but we were always headed this way. I'm not blaming the strike for that. They were trying to make it not a profession anymore. They were trying to make it a gig economy, like Uber. They were trying to turn it into Uber. And so now we preserved it being a profession, but it's going to be a profession for fewer. and it's going to be a profession for fewer and people who frankly are more established. The reason I had a job to go back to is because they already knew who I was.
Well, and they'd already, you were working on shows that they'd already had a financial commitment and investment at a big level, which meant you were in a, they needed you because in many cases, in a way that they hadn't. I want to bring Chris Hord in. Thank you both for that. That was extremely helpful and good. So Chris Hord, from your perspective, you know, listening to what Chris Kaiser and Courtney said, how are you feeling, or how are you and Matt feeling kind of leading into the strike?
It's funny, we were so overwhelmed with, we were going in production on Daredevil, so we were like 24/7. It's all I was really doing. I was in New York, and just, you know, it was similar actually to what Courtney was just talking about. Like, we had a room, and actually we really pushed, and I think we got about 20 weeks or something like that, you know, and a good amount of people for 20 weeks. And that was all us really pushing for that. Marvel, they're like, why do you need that? And we're like, well, we're doing 18 episodes. This is what it's just got to be. And they finally relented on that. But so we were quite overwhelmed. And I remember, because I was there for the previous strike, and I wasn't quite as busy, and I was getting the emails and reading the emails a bit more, and I could feel the drum beats happening. Whereas in this go round, maybe I wasn't paying attention, but I didn't really know what the issues were until we were on strike. And it was great to hear and to learn about, and you know, and go to the meetings and things like that once we were on strike. But I really hadn't, unfortunately, paid much attention to it because I was so just trying to keep my head above water. And we went on strike in New York. I just flew home and got back here and just started hitting the lines and, you know, learning a bit more about the issues. But at the end of the day, what struck me the most was the preservation of the writer's room. That's my favorite part of any TV show. It's my favorite part of the job, because the writers are great people. It's the creative backbone of any show. It's the heart of any show. So to think that that was being threatened in that, you know, as real as that was kind of scary to me. And I think once I understood that argument, I was like, yeah, we have to do this. And it was, we'll get into it, but the journey was really interesting. And I have to say, it was a real front row seat to I'm sure they take these things in business school, but the idea of leverage in any negotiation is kind of the key, right, of any negotiation. And to see the leverage shift over 148 days, I think it was kind of remarkable. And that really proved to me the power of a union, the power of a strike like this. Because we didn't have the leverage going in, or it didn't feel like we did, but then, you know,
well, because particularly because the studio and their publicists were telling everyone that you had no leverage and we're going to smoke you out. I want to pick up with Chris Kaiser on something that Courtney brought up, only because it's a running argument I've had with friends of mine who are studio executives about the cost structure. And this was certainly a running argument during the strike about, well, we can't agree to this because it would bankrupt us, or to Courtney's point with the mini rooms. And I was going back because I, for 20 years more, negotiated deals. And I know what the percentage is because I do indie film too, of what you want to keep writing fees to. They're not the majority of the budget. So there's all, as Courtney said, I'm feeling it now too. There is all this cost pressure that the studios are under to cut costs. And the studios, for some reason, seem to look to the writers who are developed as this key cost, but they're a very small percentage of their overall operating costs. So Chris Kaiser, do you have any, you know, you were there or getting the feedback of this whole perception of the vast expense of this thing that you cannot make the content without?
Yeah, first of all, there's always been a little bit of that disconnect, strange, and we never really understood, well, I think we have some idea why, that the companies are very intent on cutting labor costs. They have been very successful in doing that. And they do that particularly with writers or actors who are not, you know, the series regulars, the most highly paid. They do that really aggressively, even as costs are skyrocketing. So writers' pay was down by an enormous amount over the last 5-10 years, but the costs of making television and movies went way up, and that's way up for a whole lot of reasons. One of them is A-list actor fees, but there are other things as well. The price of lumber is also part of it, and also the kind of shows they wanted. I mean, they weren't making stuff like Daredevil and Power back in the 1980s. That stuff was much cheaper. The things that look like movies now cost like what movies cost. So in any case, so that's the first thing. The second thing is the writers, the cost of we put a lot of money back in writers' pockets and gave a lot of protection to writers in the course of the NBA negotiations. But almost none of it affects the company's bottom line, and they've always known that. I don't think the CEOs understood it from the beginning, but the CEOs were very explicit late in the process, all of them in private conversations with me and David Goodman, that they had come to terms with the fact that, in fact, what we were asking wasn't really going to affect their bottom line. I'll give you an example of why, and I think Courtney and Chris can back me up. You do a television show, and the cost of the episode is, let's say, $5 million, and it's probably a lot more than that. Your writer's budget for an episode is $70,000. If somebody says the NBA, we're going to negotiate something, and that writer's budget is now going to be $85,000, that's $15,000. You don't get $15,000 more in your budget. You have a little bit less in the VSX front, or you cut a song from the episode. You deliver it at the same budget if you're on budget, and if you're not, that's a studio's separate problem. But what we kept saying to the CEOs is these changes simply shift back in favor of human beings, a budget that has, for the most part, moved away from taking care of human beings. And so one of the reasons why, in the end, we got almost everything we wanted was because none of the companies looked at the deal they were making and thought, we can't afford this. The stuff we got for screenwriters was a guaranteed second step, which we could talk about at some point, has meaningful psychological and practical implications for screenwriters, but near zero economic implication for the studios. All of the protections of the writer's room that we've implemented simply guarantee that the way shows have been run for the last 50 years were still in place. They weren't new costs. They were just the reestablishment of the old way, and all absorbable into budget. So look, there has been for years, and even at the very beginning of streaming, everyone said not all of these streamers are going to make it. What ended up happening, I'll do this very quickly, is all of the streamers followed Netflix off a cliff. Netflix spent money without regard immediately to profits because they thought that volume and the development of the customer base was going to win the game for them. And they were right. And then everyone else spent to keep up without actually understanding their business model. And then Wall Street came back to them and said, no, that's not okay. We actually need to see profits. And so now, and for other reasons that have something to do, I think, with the way in which people are paid on the front end and not the back end, there are a lot of things that cost too much that are not giving them a proper return on investment. And so there's going to be a retrenchment. They're going to stop making shows in the same way, and they're going to stop making movies the way they did. Quite apart from, by the way, the knock-on effect of the strike, which is meaningful in 2024, particularly in the movie business. So they were always slowing that down, and that had been true for a couple of years, and we knew that. And we're going to have to live through that for some period of time. I happen to think that equilibrium will be reestablished at some point, that the winners in the streaming game will still be the winners, that there will be billions of viewers who want to watch this, and eventually they're going to have to compete with each other by making things. They may never go back to exactly the same old position they were in before. What's very difficult is we as writers live in a given moment, and our careers they're not long. And so people will suffer. People are going to get hurt who fall into this moment in time, and it's really hard. It's really difficult, and it is, I think, as Courtney said, it's particularly difficult for younger writers or older writers or writers of color or LGBTQ writers. It's particularly true because the other thing the companies are going to do, and executives have said this to me, and I'm interested that you've heard this too, is they're going straight down the middle now. They're not taking risks anymore. They're going back to established ideas and old showrunners and the same old thing, and they're not experimenting in the way they did. Somebody said to me, we're just in the era of law firms and medical shows and people in suits and ties and that stuff. It's not universally true. There will be other shows, but we're moving in that direction for a time, and that's going to be very difficult for writers. But having said that, the Guild and all of us writers, we need to make sure that when times are good, the conditions for writers are good enough, as I said, to sustain a living. So particularly during difficult times, it's important to set minimum standards, because during difficult times, during times of retrenchment, that's when writers are really poorly treated. And actors too, by the way, and crew members and all of that. So everyone's got.
I would say, Chris, that's the value that you got though with you guys were able to get with the, viewership based streaming residuals. Like that's the type of thing that can sustain a writer in those times. And that was a huge win. I think that was going in, I thought that's great that we're asking for it. It's amazing. I don't know how they're going to do it. It just seemed like the last thing they ever wanted to agree to, but
And it was. And
that was a huge one.
Right. And it's still just a foot in the door, but it solves the problem that sorry for Courtney for just using you as an example over and over again, but you're here, is that residuals are the way that writers maintain themselves when they don't work, right? It's the money that comes in. In broadcast, if you had a really successful show that ran a lot, you made a fair amount in residuals. If you wrote for Power, you made more than if you wrote for a show that lasted for 6 episodes and disappeared. But the way the streaming services have designed things, they had disentangled value from individual episodes and refused to pay residuals on them. This is a move back towards saying, if something really is, if it persists on your platform, if people continue to watch it over years, then writers who are part of that, not just the showrunners, and most importantly, not showrunners, but everybody else, they need to get something back for it. It's just but it's not a big, it's only we just opened the door in this negotiation.
But that was a huge door to open. I mean,
well, let's check onto this, and maybe we'll give Courtney the first word, because Chris, or then you moved to resolution and what was getting out of it. I mean, Courtney, do you feel quite satisfied? Chris, like sort of expressing even surprised that in the end got things. How are you feeling now with the strike resolved?
You're muted, Courtney.
I had to cough before and I was like, let me mute, and then I forgot. I don't know how to use Zoom, guys. It's the first time I've ever used it. So I would say I was surprised at how well we did overall. I was surprised at some of the things that the studios didn't want to do that were going to cost them no money. All along, I sort of was baffled by some of their thoughts and their thinking. I do feel, I don't think this is a secret, I do feel that by the end we were at the losing game. We were at a point where it was about to turn in a way that was not going to be helpful for any writer or any crew member. Had the strike gone on until January, meaning now, I think it would have been a disaster in many ways. And so I'm very grateful that it ended when it ended. I don't know. I mean, it's a weird thing. Before the strike, Chris Kaiser and I had a sort of a conversation, and it turns out, in my estimation, we were both right. He was right that we needed to strike and that we needed to fight for these things, and I have turned out to be right about the impact on young people, on people of color, on women. Like, it actually has worked out exactly as I think we both hoped and feared, which is that it is better for writers to preserve the profession. As I keep saying, I mean, that's what I would say all the time. Preserve the profession, preserve the profession. I'm a television writer. That's what I do. I don't really write features, and I don't know how to write a book, and I don't know how to write a play. I write for television, and I want to make more TV writers like myself, and et cetera, et cetera. But for me, I will say that we did a wonderful job. Our negotiating committee and Chris and all these wonderful people, blood, sweat, and tears to get us where we are. And yet the shrinkage of the business is terrifying. Now, one thing about those viewer-based residuals that is really important to connect to what both Chris's have said is that if you have an idea right now for a mainstream, down the line, sort of lawyer, doctor, cop procedural, This is the best effing time to get that on the air because the viewer-based residual door has opened. Get as many people in the tent as possible. This may not be the right time for your beautifully curated, tiny jewel box of an idea that's about you and your friends and the summer of 1989 at camp. Maybe not right now. But what Chris Kaiser says is true. This is all cyclical. In a few years, everyone might be going, we need a summer camp story. And then you'll be right there with that script in the drawer. But for right now, if you can figure out a way to do lawyer hospital or cop lawyer, I say do that and do that to the best of your ability. I am very lucky to be in the seat that I'm in because I created a show that a lot of Black people wanted to watch and they all watched it. I was very lucky, and that was a lot of people. But why? It was a cops and robbers show, guys. I mean, I'm not, I didn't reinvent the wheel. I'm from broadcast. I'm broadcast trained. I don't care. I don't need it to be fancy. I don't need to write Succession. I'm P.T. Barnum. I want a big tent. And if you are a person who has a big tent, this is what your Writers Guild got for you, which is that you can, the networks will allow you to employ more people. If you have that bigger order, right? If you get that 18 or 20, you can get a bunch of people in your room. And right now, for me and for all of us who are showrunners, I don't want to speak for the Chris's, but this is how I feel. I'm just trying to get people employed. I'm just trying to get shows on the air so I can get writers' jobs. And like Chris Ord, I was in a room. I was in a writer's room up until the very minute. We ended on a Monday and we went on strike on a Tuesday morning. And I was just trying to get my people paid. I was like, write all the drafts, just write the drafts so I can send them in because I want you to get paid. And I guess, ultimately, I just want us to be employed. That's the thing. And now we can be employed for longer. And some people will actually get to go to set that weren't going to be able to get to go to set. Some of those fights we don't have to fight individually. Am I making sense? I hope I am. I know I sound
no. That I think that's
I'm
very
so
well said.
I'm just really impassioned about kids being able to go to set. Because if Greg Berlanti hadn't forced me to go on set and like kicked me, or Bernie Mac, when I was on the Bernie Mac show, and I went on set and I had to deal with, comedians, no offense to anybody, it toughened me up and it made me a better writer and it made me a better producer. And I wouldn't have been able to do those things, especially in a time where shows are so remote. So if you live in LA, your show may not be.
Yeah.
It's just, it's important.
It was shocking to me that they didn't. I mean, I guess it's just dollars and cents, but like that a network would not want this, and they would not want writers to learn, because every writer that comes back from set comes back much stronger a writer, much stronger a producer. It can only help the show improve. It can only get, end up with a better show.
Here's my hot take.
It's shocking to me.
Sorry to interrupt. Here's my hot take. My very hot take on all of this is that they still don't understand what we do. I think there's a fundamental lack of understanding of the magic of the writer, of the person who lives their life going, what if, what if, what if, what if? And I think that they don't understand it, and so therefore they devalue it. Whereas it's easier to understand for them what the actor does or what the director does. I don't really know that they understand what magic it is to have 7 or 8 people in a room coming up with stuff. I think they figure, oh, well, just 1 or 2 of you can do that, right? Yeah. No, not just 1 or 2 of us. And in growing as writers, that's how you get that great stuff. There was a lot of talk about, well, Mike White does it all by himself. Well, Mike White was on, Dawson's Creek. He was on a writing staff. He produced. Like, it's not like you get these things out of nowhere. So, I sometimes think it's just about not understanding what our value is.
Well, you use the magic of what showrunners.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, Courtney, the other thing is, and this works against us, is showrunners end up, they have their names on the shows, they have an enormous amount of pride of authorship. And so if a studio executive says, you know what, I think I can save money by cutting writers and maybe not using a writer's room, but I'll dump all this stuff on a showrunner. Will you produce something for me? Showrunners do everything they need to do to make things good. And so I have always found that network and studios, they don't suffer the consequences of the cuts because the people who remain have so much pride in what they do that they make it as good as they can. Now, it may not be quite as good as it would have been, but you don't know that case, right? That's an unknown, that's the road not taken. They don't know what that is. They have no sense of what it means 10 years from now that people will not have been trained. And while we were in the negotiating room, one of the writers stood up and told a story about the first room he was ever in, and the showrunner who taught him and two other writers how to make television shows. And they went off and they made many successful shows. And from those shows, both women and men, and one of them was a woman of color, and she made many shows and taught other people, and they made many shows. And he said, here's the tree that grew from a single show because we were allowed to do things the right way. And you don't have any sense of what you've lost when you cut that tree down.
Chris Kaiser, could you also say, because I think Courtney, we're all talking because we all know what each other does, but I think I want to give a shout out to all of you, but maybe you could quickly, better than me, being a showrunner and a television writer is an extremely unique job, even in the writing profession. Personally, to me, what I think is expected of showrunners isn't expected anywhere else in the business or in any other kind of job, where a creative person is expected to learn to become a business person, or certainly a producer, with a multi-million-dollar budget, often in the span of 20 weeks. So Chris, could you, for those who maybe aren't in the industry, who joined us or just beginning, it's so unique even in the business, to Courtney's point of, I was going to say it's the studios doing magical thinking, that just they can slash and burn everything and still get the same quality because for punishment. But Chris, do you want to maybe speak to that and just give us also, just in the interest of time, your perspective of how satisfied you are with the outcome and the resolution, especially to Courtney and Chris Ord's point of the length of the strike and the damage that was done by that length financially?
Me or Chris Ord? Who are you asking?
Chris Kaiser.
Okay. Yeah, so you're right. It's, the writing profession, like a lot of things, is odd. You do one thing and then you're asked to do something else. It's like I always think, if you're a really good campaigner in politics, then you get to govern, but being a good campaigner has nothing to do with being able to govern. As a writer, particularly as a showrunner, you're going to be able to pitch things really well. And if you can pitch something really well, you can get your show on the air, and then you have to write it. But being a good pitcher doesn't necessarily mean you're a good writer. You also spend your entire career, certainly in the old days, very old days when I was doing it, and slightly less old days when everyone else on the screen was doing it, you spent a lot of time learning how to write, maybe a little bit learning how to produce. And you became a very good, we hope, very good writer. And they handed you a show and said, now you are so much more than a writer. Your responsibility, as you said, is to be the kind of the CEO of a small company. It employs hundreds of people. It produces a product at a breakneck speed. You have to be good at writing, at managing writers, at hiring the right people with other people to help you, at picking music, at editing, at all of these things. You got to do all of those things. You've got to do them all at the same time, on time and under budget. You've got to learn how to deal with actors who can be complicated. You have to know how to deal with networks who give you notes and may not be happy. And that's not so easy. So you have to do all of these things all at once. And you used to be able to do that with people who helped you, who were going to write all the way through, who would visit the set for you, who could go to the editing room with you, any of those things. And all of a sudden, over the last bunch of years, showrunners have been asked to do that more or less on their own. So it became a really difficult job. I will say that, I was a lawyer beforehand, and lawyers are a very unhappy bunch, not universally, but by and large. But our young showrunners as a group were very miserable over the last bunch of years, because this thing that was the pinnacle of the profession, this, the ability to make something that meant so much to you and to do the best job you possibly could, became such an overwhelming burden. It was so difficult with so few, or the fewest resources you could possibly have to do that job, that people, they felt as if that they were living in a kind of a job/prison. And it was very, very different. It's not true universally, but I've talked to lots of showrunners beforehand, young showrunners in particular, and some older ones as well. So that's a showrunner's job. The showrunner's job is to oversee everything and have a finger in all things. Different showrunners handle those things differently, but it is a unique and very difficult thing. The best part of it, and I completely agree with Courtney, is to see people move up and learn and have their own shows. That is the thing that makes me the happiest now. I've had a bunch of writing assistants who have had their own shows on the air, and I love watching that happen. And it's so much harder now. It's harder with 8 episodes because you can't give people advantages as you did before. You can't watch them grow. You go back and talk to writers you used to know, and they say, gee, I haven't been on set in 3 years. I've only written 2 episodes. I've never been in an editing room. It's just it's a painful thing to watch that happen. I think we were pretty successful at establishing a structural protections to make sure that wasn't true. We raised wages for people. We did things like make sure that the youngest writers get script fees, the staff writers get script fees, which they didn't before, which is a little complicated to explain, but it's a meaningful thing. We made sure writers need to go to set. I agree with Courtney that we were reaching sort of the end of where, the point at which things needed to break in our favor. And they did. And I will say, I can't give away too much. On the inside, we had a sense that was happening. I mean, we can't express everything to writers out loud that we knew, but you could see stuff moving privately in a direction. But there was a lot of conversation. Oh, this strike can't go to January. It can't go to next March or something. It was never going to do that. We were never going to be able to do that. We wouldn't have been able to sustain it, and we wouldn't have asked people to do it. But I think we ended at the right time. But it's the hardest part of all of this. And some of us on the negotiating committee, for example, were the ones who were also handing out money to people from the strike fund who weren't okay. The hardest thing is seeing people suffer through it. It's really, really difficult. But when Courtney and I we had really good conversations, not just the beginning, but all the way through, talking about the difficulty of waging what is in a sense a war, and where you're sort of caught between the idea that you can't protect without the risk of injury. And so without the risk of injury, you're in big trouble. But the thing is, the injury doesn't apply equally to everybody. We live in a world in which people suffer unequally. They are rewarded unequally. They suffer unequally. And all of that is really difficult. It's particularly difficult for the Writers Guild because you can't tell here because you have 3 showrunners, people who are running shows on this. But the Writers Guild is made up of people who are, who work in, as I said, like comedy variety and make movies, and some of them make big movies, and some of them make indie movies, and some of them work twice in 5 years, and some of them work every single day. And we had to figure out a way to talk to everybody and say, will you fight for each other? That wasn't an easy thing to do. And it didn't happen because we asked. It happened because writers believed in doing it in the long run. But it's really hard. It's really hard to, we're a different kind of guild or union than most unions. We're not like the auto workers or anything. We do very different jobs. We have very different economic situations at the same time. So it's a particularly complicated thing for writers to be united the way they were. And they were never more united than they were during this strike.
Courtney, did you want to weigh in on?
I just had one really quick thing to say, a very concrete example of show running. I had an episode of Power. I don't know if any of you guys ever watched Power, but we had an episode of Power where we had our main character had to beat someone to death with a weight. And we had to decide whether or not we were going to spend $42,000 on a fake head that we could smush the skull, have brain matter and blood fly everywhere, or if we were going to get a techno crane for another shot. And it just so happened that shot that director wanted to do, the crane rental was $42,000 and the head was $42,000. And ultimately, I was not going to be able to shoot the scene that needed the crane, and I wasn't going to be able to spend that money. One of those had to go. And I felt my decision as the showrunner is not only do I decide where the money should go, do I decide the impact on the impact on the audience is going to be better with the skull, but then I also have to rewrite to budget. So get rid of the crane shot altogether, and whatever that scene was, how do I tell that story differently? Which is why we have that job, because the budget and the script have to go hand in hand in a very specific way. It has to be to budget every week. Otherwise you're screwed. And so that's my concrete example. I always think about that skull because the two things actually worked out to the exact same amount of money.
And the budget's never enough. So you got to find a way to do it, no matter how much big it is.
And then the other adage, the first year the actors work for you, the second year you work together, and the third year you work for them. There's also that. So
the joke I heard about show running is somebody said it's like a pie eating contest where the prize is more pie.
Yeah, that's Matt Weiner.
Essentially, what is that? What he said? Because I hadn't heard that before until like last year. I was like, oh yeah, that's pretty good. I like that.
I like Liz.
Go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was going to say, I like Liz Friedlander's one. Show running is being strangled to death by your own dream.
Yeah.
That's a good.
So
But
just
we
in the
shouldn't
interest of-
acknowledge though, Chris, you got the term showrunner in the NBA, which I don't think had ever been done before.
That's true. That's true.
And that's a huge, huge thing. Like again, this was a massive victory, this strike. Like the stuff that came out of it, like the studios didn't want to put that word in. They didn't want to acknowledge that a showrunner was behind the shows for whatever reason.
Right.
But again, you guys pulled that off.
We did. The breadth of stuff that was was greater than ever before, and that was very nice. But yeah,
Yeah, there are a lot. I just
not
went through
everything.
it, and they released the new NBA, and there's a lot more pages in it and sections. And even
Yeah.
I want to hear from you, because this has been such an interesting. You guys made such great observations, but we're going to be short on time. I want to pivot to the sort of outlook question, and Chris, I'll start with you. I just was going to also, kind of make this point that a lot of the things that were won and this is another unique thing about the business, is the Writers Guild agreement is the baseline. Most successful writers get paid at rates above those. And part of the reason that happens, at least in my opinion, is that very often writers don't work every year, as Chris Kaiser and the panelists have said. And so that's also why sort of fees are oversized. But from my chair, negotiates or works with people to negotiate deals for writers, what the studios agreed to was the bare minimum expectation, and in some cases a little bit better. And then there's other aspects like on the residual front, which isn't negotiated in individual contracts. But we've kind of, I feel like the resolution has right-sized the minimum basic agreement to what everyone's baseline expectation was, not the going rate for someone who is successful in juggling multiple shows. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing of the sort of bigness that the studios were sort of saying they gave all these things, and not to diminish the wins, because it's very important to have that baseline. But that's also the irony in the step of, we've sort of codified the minimum expectation that everyone had, and it's still, as you guys are talking about, I think, not going to create a foundation where everyone's suddenly going to be able to totally sustain themselves financially as a writer, unless they're juggling multiple shows. So I'm curious, with that background, and maybe Chris, or we'll start with you, of what's your outlook moving forward, given that we're still, as Courtney and Chris Kaiser already said, the industry is, we're still at a point of contraction, even with this positive resolution.
I do think, I mean, the contraction was coming, I think, regardless of the strike, I believe. Like there was just so many shows, and the arms race between the streamers couldn't continue. I mean, for me, the deal, I mean, it is the minimum basic agreement. It is the minimum, but it's really, for me, it's about the precedents that are set. And you spoke to it earlier, Chris, like the previous strike, we got language in there about jurisdiction over the internet. And without that, it just become, the studios can kind of run rampant. So the minimums are great and they're just really important. But to me, it's about the language that gets put in there and how the job is kind of addressed in a way, or at least treated by the studios. And I think, I mean, we'll see how it all plays out, but I'm very optimistic about how this deal is going to play out for the members. I mean, contraction aside. But and then yeah, so that would be my, I think it's a great deal, and but it's really about the precedents that were set than any sort of minimum number for me.
Courtney, what's your outlook? I'll give Chris Kaiser the last word on the outlook.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think my outlook is, I mean, it's kind of what I said already, which is that I think for the next couple of years, the shows that the audience is going to receive a lot of mass shows, a lot of shows that are not going to be as specific. I think the good thing about those shows is sometimes if they have longer orders, they can get more writers. I think one thing that is bothering me is that the shows that we talk about are not the shows that have the biggest audience a lot of the time. So everyone runs around talking about Succession. Succession's highest amount of numbers was like 2 million. That is not a hit, really. it's a hit because we keep talking about it, but it's not a hit in the sense of like most people in America are watching it. You know what I'm saying? It's not like, you know, ER. I know we're never going to get to those days again to some extent, but it's interesting when you mention Chris Kaiser and Party of Five. Everyone I know watched Party of Five. Everyone. Like it wasn't, and so to me, a hit is something where it's like blanketed. And I think the more that we are doing these things, where we're talking about, they're not greenlighting the Successions or the Bears or the like, you know, or the Beefs necessarily right now, but those are the shows that are getting the attention on the award circuit. And yet, you know, we're sort of at a weird crossroads right now, I think, between what the television industry does to itself and what it does to deliver to the consumer and the view of the consumer. And I think we're going to have to go through some change in order to get back to a place where television is actually serving the audience, truly serving the audience, and not just serving to protect executive employment. If that makes any sense, so that the executives are no longer just afraid for their jobs with the decisions that they make. I hope that wasn't a shady way of saying it, but since both of the Chris's are laughing, I think they both know what I mean.
No, I think you made
Resonates.
some excellent points. I was ranting about that about Succession just the other day, exactly the same way. As much as I love the show, having Chris Kaiser just coming off that sort of show, what is your outlook on what's been a rather rough 2 weeks?
By the way, I want to say that what Courtney said is, I think she's right. The television business followed the movie business. Once the calendar went away, there's been a division between the very popular and the highly awarded in large measure. Abbott Elementary may be a great example of something that bridges both really nicely. But that's not, you know, you tend to get versions of like in the movie business where which is why like the Golden Globes had an award for commercial success because they're desperately trying for a Barbie that both gets those kinds of attention. So it's a very complicated thing. I also think, by the way, that one of the things that happened in cable, in streaming, is that Stranger Things in some ways became like the Jaws of the television business, which is all of these streaming services began by thinking they were going to make niche shows and then realized that with Game of Thrones and Stranger Things, they should make Jaws. And the Jaws was a really big thing. And so they're now going to chase tent poles. And so I think you're going to see a lot of very cheap stuff and some really, really big, expensive things and some stuff that's right down the middle. And that is complicated for audiences, and they'll have to decide, and they'll tell the broadcasters and the cable networks what they think by watching or not watching. I think, as Courtney said, and I think I had hinted to, all of this is cyclical. It will all change over a period of time. Unfortunately, as we writers, we have shorter horizons than the industry has, and so we live according to the rules of the time in which we live. I will say, by the way, one other thing, Todd, because I mostly, but don't entirely agree. I mean, I think here's a thing that's happening in the business, which is the guild sets minimums, and minimums are really important. They didn't used to be everything, because it used to be that agents could negotiate above scale deals for people based on their experience and their talent. That happens much less now. There is much less above scale pay. Minimums have become what almost all writers make. 50% of writers in the Writers Guild make minimum, regardless of who they are. 25% of showrunners in the Writers Guild make the least amount of money per week that the contract will allow. And I would bet you a lot of those people are younger showrunners and women and people of color. They make nothing more than the least amount the studio can pay them, which is one of the reasons why we felt a real pressure to increase minimums. But we couldn't increase them. You can't increase them too high, because if you increase them too high, you put a huge disadvantage to the less experienced writer the studios will not pay for the same amount of money if they're paying a co-EP minimum per week, which they are paying to a lot of people. So we're in a difficult situation that's more complicated than we can talk about now. But the contract solves some problems. It cannot solve all of them. It requires agents to get out there and do the job, and lawyers to do the jobs they had done before, which is to to actually see that there's a ladder of success in this business. The way people stay in, the way that you open doors is not just to let people in for the first year or 2 years or 3 years, to provide a ladder of opportunity and success that means that you can actually sustain a career out of it. You have enough money in the bank to stop being on staff and write a pilot and take a risk on creating something, on yourself and your own ideas. All of those things are necessary in the broader ecosystem of the writing business for us to have the kind of work that's flourished over the last 50 years. There are a lot of problems with the way things used to be. Very few people, very few networks, very few people decided, very narrow portion of the world worked. It's broader now than it used to be, but there are other kinds of problems, and we're never solving all of them at once. And so I don't want anyone to think that it was a very important thing. I think it was important for writers. I think it stopped a movement in the business that would have been really dangerous. And it turned out to have some meaning in the American labor movement as well, in ways that we didn't anticipate. But the fight to make sure that good stuff is made and that showrunners get to produce the stuff they want to produce, and that younger writers have a chance to move up, that's an ongoing fight that is not just a guild fight, but it also requires the work of other people in the industry. So nothing is ever settled in this, and there's anything in the world. Obviously, the battle just keeps going. It was a good year, a meaningful game. But that's
and I'll add to that. Thank you for that clarification. And I'll add to that I feel like, at least for the moment in time, writers and I think extensive directors and producers, because oftentimes people do all of those roles, feel a little bit more emboldened to say no to the studios when, we haven't even really delved into the whole free work thing, which is still going to exist, probably going to exist forever. But I do feel like from a rep chair and from a writer chair, people feel a little bit more empowered to be like, hold up a second. That wasn't part of the deal. That's a lot of work. If you want that, maybe you need to pay for it, or maybe we need to figure out a different solution. So I think that's another, because in the end, the length was long and painful, but it was a big win. And that long may that last. I want to just be, in the interest of time, want to open it up now to questions. There was one question, and Courtney touched on this, and I think it's really important to all of us, that I wanted to go back to, which was, let me give credit to, I think her name was Ren, was saying that, his or her, sorry, other pronouns, would each of you give your point of view on advice for younger writers, either who are already just broken into industry or just graduated from Brown and are ready to hit the pavement? Like, what would you tell them? And also maybe comment on, is it actually the same advice that you would have given 5 or 10 years ago, or is it different?
I'll go first real quick. I have sort of different advice depending on how old you are, but this is what I'll say. If you're an older person and you want to break into TV and you have a great idea, I would almost say write a novel and own your IP and then try to get it. Because I think there is something to people wanting things that have already been proven. This has been walking around a lot lately. It's like they were only buying IP, so whatever. But if you're younger, you need to get an assistant job in the business and learn. And young agency jobs obviously are there. I hire assistants, but get out here. I don't know how to do it someplace else. I know other people say you can do it in New York now. I don't know how to do it. I just know that Los Angeles is kind of still ground zero. And then my advice never changes in this way. You need to have 2 features, one spec pilot and one pilot of your own, and then a short story or a 1-act play. You need to have all of those samples, because you never know when someone might want to read something. And just speaking of for myself, I do not read pilots from writers who are just starting out, because I'm not hiring you necessarily to write your voice. I'm hiring you to write the voice of the show. So I need to know whether or not you can imitate a voice. I don't want you to spec my show, but if you have an ability to spec, say, a Blackish or an Abbott Elementary, then I know you can differentiate voices. I know that you can find a joke. I know you can find funny. And I have a tendency to read comedy because I think comedy is harder than drama. That's my own opinion, even though I'm a drama writer. So I guess that would be that's my concrete advice, is have a lot of samples. Don't just have one beautifully curated pilot that you've been working on for like 5 years, because you don't want to send that around town because your name's not out there and someone will steal it. Sorry to be that real, but it is.
No,
what
I think that's great advice, and I think that's then I'll let Chris Ward and Chris Kaiser weigh in. I feel like the biggest thing, and as a rep, what I look for is someone who is committed to writing. If you're a writer, you got to write a lot, and you can't get, as you say, hung up, because once you're a professional writer, you got to produce, and so quality matters, but there has to be a volume to it that you're able to sustain.
Oh, sorry. One other quick thing. A lot of kids think that Issa Rae is the model, which is like make your own show on YouTube and then get discovered and then get your show. Two things about that. Issa was not the showrunner of Insecure. The showrunner of Insecure is Prentice Penny. So there's like a writer behind there, but also Issa is a very specific blend of being totally gorgeous and funny and super talented. And I'm not saying you're not all those things, whoever you are, but it's a very specific set of skills that gets lightning to hit in a bottle. And you're better off doing what Todd says, write your ass off, write every single day, get up and write, go to bed writing. Like, that's better. You're better off.
Chris Ward, thoughts on
I
advice?
agree. I don't know if there's much I could add to that. I mean, you just got to get out here and write. And if you give a script, whenever somebody gives me a script to read, I just say, well, it'll take me however long to read it, but I assume you're writing something else. Like the second you give your script in, like just go to the next thing, because you can't put I don't know, it's such you have to have a certain amount of faith in the fates and luck. I hate to say it, like it's to me, like it's hard. It's all hard. You have to do the hard work, and then you have to get some breaks along the way. And I don't know how you advise someone to do that. You got to just sort of want to do that, and you got to want to write. So I don't know. That's about all I can add.
Chris Kaiser, any pearls
No,
that
I
go
mean,
with that, or?
I tend to give the same general advice to people. I say to people, it's going to take a lot of years. Make sure you're living a life that you like and can sustain while you're doing it, because it is unlikely to happen quickly. You know what I mean? You gotta have a job, whatever it is, whether it's an assistant job, as Courtney said, or whatever you end up being able to do. But it's got to make you you got to have enough money and live in a place where you don't say after 6 or 9 months, I need to get out of here and do something that takes care of me better. If you can last and keep writing, then you have a chance of making it. And then I said, then it's like, keep writing, keep producing stuff. Don't wait around, meet people, send stuff out. Don't ask too many people for advice, but ask some. Don't be precious, but don't rush. You know, it's going to take some time. I think it will take more time now than it used to, probably. I mean, everything changes. But I used to say to people, if you stick with it, you're likely to make it. And, you know, I probably believe that's slightly less than I used to in this moment, but broadly speaking, nothing has changed, right? Unless you have connections, and I came out with no connections, is you just keep writing and you keep on saying hello to people and sending stuff and ask for help. Write to people and say something. If you're a part of a Brown network and you know Brown people, you know, who have graduated before, ask them for help. Everyone who got here asked for help from somebody, and everyone understands it. Everyone's open to new ideas. And the job is not, no one will say, I won't read you because you're new. The job is to get your stuff to the top of somebody's pile, because the pile is very large. And so that's not easy to do, and it takes time, and it's often my first job was a person handed something to a person who handed it to a person who handed it to a person who called me finally and said, hey, I think what you do might be interesting to me. And you never know when it's going to happen.
And I'll add, just because we're on a Brown alumni call, that definitely, if you go to any competitive college or even a good four-year college that maybe is less competitive, use your alumni networks. It can really be really useful. And generally people are very receptive. There's kind of a bar that's already lowered where they say, oh, well, this is likely to be a like-minded person, or they feel a debt to where they went. I want to bring in another question on a totally different note, but it's certainly a hot topic. So I'm curious what the panelists think, and probably our second to last question before I let everyone go off into the end of their weekend. David Marcus asked about AI and whether, you know, I think we're really out ahead of what we know is going to happen or could happen with AI, but Are the panelists, obviously it was a topic in the negotiation. I think it ended up being this sort of last sticking point. So I think the public maybe misconstrued its centralness to the negotiation, that it wasn't the biggest issue that came last, at least in my opinion. But how are you guys, or how much time are you even spending worrying about AI right now?
I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it, but I probably should be. But I just don't have I think, Chris, being on the board, you probably heard a lot more stories. You got a lot more info about the dangers of it, but I haven't really seen it impact anything that I've been related to in the business.
You're Courtney, unmute yourself.
Same here, and I would also say my favorite sign, my absolute favorite sign from the strike was AI didn't go to fat camp. And what that means ultimately is that we as writers we're a compendium and an amalgam of all of our experiences. That's what we bring to the table. But the other thing that I would say is that AI can't take their notes. So the thing that I think is really interesting is part of our job is to be able to interpret what the executive thinks they think would make your piece of writing or your show better, and then somehow in what they've said to you make something that actually is better, even if what they said to you is not. And so I think, for me, I don't know how you get rid of the entire human experience. It's like they were remember that everyone was saying that they were gonna automate the post office entirely. When you go to the post office now, there's still people in there, same as the DMV. At some point, you can't actually automate every experience, and certainly the human experience, which is our job, which is to provide catharsis to other humans who are watching the content and having how can you replicate that? So I don't know. That's I don't stay up late at night worrying about AI. But I think if I were 22, maybe I would. My career will be over before it's a huge problem.
Well, Chris Kaiser did stay up late worrying about AI. So, Chris, what would you add to that? Thank you, Courtney.
I feel like I have a complicated answer for this, and I'll try to go relatively quickly and answer all the different parts of it. First of all, AI was on our radar, but not way up at the top of it when we went into all of this. The time we spent during the negotiation made it increasingly important. A lot of that was because the companies refused to talk about it. So we had made the assumption that because the companies were really interested in their copyright, and because at least now the court said that AI-generated material is not copyrightable, that the companies would be very scared of that, and we would be more clearly partnered with them in creating a solution to that. They did not behave that way at the beginning of the negotiation. Even now, I think part of that is just because of the way negotiations work, where they're just programmed to say no to everything. In the end, I don't think we don't know, obviously, what AI is capable of, and nothing we're seeing now of AI doing is what AI is actually doing in labs now, or will be doing a year from now. So there's no way to know. I don't think we ever thought, or I don't think the majority of us thought, that the big issue was, at least with regard to the companies, that AI would replace us. I do think we thought that it would change the relationship to creative material, and that it might, if used, make things more efficient so that fewer writers were necessary, because you could be asked to rewrite AI-generated material, or AI could do that for you, or come up with stories, particularly if you're writing a certain kind of show that tends to deal with stories that repeat in patterns. So we worried about all of those things. And most of the solutions that we created inside the contract will protect writers' rights with regard to the way they and AI could write stuff. So, and I don't want to go into all of it, but we protected writers' compensation, their credit, and what's called separated rights, which are other contractual rights that they have in their material. And we did that by saying that you can't be forced to rewrite AI can't rewrite you, AI can't get credit, a whole bunch of different things. So we did that. The second big thing that we had to deal with, I know I'm going pretty quickly, and the thing that took a little while and went to the end, not because it was the most contentious, but because the legal language was complicated, was what does it mean to have our material train an AI program? And that was difficult to talk about because it hasn't happened yet. And because, as I said, the companies own the copyright in our material already. So they own the right to it. We have contractual rights. They have copyright rights. It's a little bit what Courtney was talking about, go write a novel and own the rights to your own IP. We don't own the right to our own IP. We gave that away a long, long time ago in return for being paid. So we said, both sides, The companies with their copyright rights, we with our contractual rights, retain all of those rights. And as the potential dual competing nightmares of the way AI might work actually move toward a real moment where we are training AI through our work, we will figure out what writers get paid for it. Not that we're going to stop it, but we're going to deal with how writers are compensated if that happens. Having said that, here's the other thing. I think the risk to writers and to original creativity is not necessarily principally, certainly not only, but not principally embodied in the relationship between us and the studios with whom we have a contractual relationship. It's the other companies that produce AI, the open AIs, the tech companies who do that, who may look to use material in, to train AI to replace us and make a kind of content that may not, I don't know, in the long run, replace all movies and TV, but an alternate to movies and TV. You could imagine a world in which one of those companies is able to create something, even on demand, to say, I'd like to watch a movie where I am the protagonist, and it takes place in the 1830s, and I am in a Jane Austen novel, and I want to end up this way. I'll make a movie for you that way. I mean, that's the kind of thing that those companies could end up doing, and we have no control over that right now because we don't have a contractual relationship with them. That, by the way, the studios should be worried about, and I think are, because their only real advantage is all of us, right? The advantage they have is the work that we do in our original creativity, and our advantage is their expertise in marketing it and the resources they have to make it. So we ought to, in the long run, be partners in that. A lot of the stuff's going to play out, like the New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI, is going to tell us a lot about the way in which those companies who don't end up owning any of the copyright get to use AI to steal the work that we make. So a lot of this is in the future. I think there are real risks out there. It's really hard to know what the scope of the risk is. I don't think it replaces human creativity entirely, but I don't think it's irrelevant to the production of creative products in the next 20 years or whatever.
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of, just to bring everything back together, which is ultimately it's kind of about the scope of labor, and which the strike was about, and what AI is kind of about, which is, can you suddenly start doing, and technology's been involved in all of this, the same amount with less people, and then people have less money. And on that note, I thought I'd just get in this last question, and then we'll need to wrap up. That is, someone asked about IATSE's contract coming up, and I had sort of asked this broader question of, like, where are we in the whole, kind of overall labor movement? What's your outlook in terms of, are you worried about IATSE? Because obviously, for those who don't know, IATSE is the broader union that represents most, but not all, of the people who actually provide the physical production services to actually make the content, to smash the $42,000 head or move the $42,000 crane. Is that something you're particularly worried about or seeing, or it's just, what's your point of view on that?
You're asking me?
Yeah, why don't you start, Chris, and then if Courtney and Chris would want to weigh in.
Look, I hope that this is a moment in which labor has realized that it has power and that it exercises that power in order to get what it deserves, and that includes all of the Teamsters and IATSE and the American, the musicians and all those people who stood with us, whose contracts are now up. I hope that they do get the things they need to survive. The thing that I worry about, the thing that I hope is not true, that I hope is true, is that the companies have learned the lesson of this strike, which is that, I mean, it was foolish behavior on their part to allow it to go this long. It came out of decades of actually keeping a tight lid on labor costs. I mean, the organization, the AMPTP, that does that, formed in the 1980s during the Reagan era, when unions were really on the decline. I don't think that's true anymore. They did not read the room properly. They didn't understand what the world was. The CEOs didn't get involved soon enough because they thought it was going to operate the way it had all the way through. They didn't even learn the lesson after SAG went on strike. Eventually they did, and they became real partners, and we concluded with reasonable agreements in a reasonable amount of time. I hope that's true for the Teamsters and IATSE as well, and for everyone else, that they're not going to give away the house. Obviously, we're going to make deals. We're going to win things and give things, but not everything we want. But I hope those workers do what they need to do to take care of themselves for the next 3 years and beyond, and that the companies understand that strikes are not the way to move forward, that real negotiation is. I mean, I said over and over again, it took us 3 days to make this deal. And most people, by the way, my friends in the business who are not executives said that their biggest reaction to our deal afterward was, I'm angry at the companies. What took them so long to make this deal? There was no reason to take all this time. When they said they were trying to starve people, that's what they were trying to do. When they said they were holding out and hoping that would make us go away, that is what happened for a long time. And I'm just praying that doesn't happen with IATSE and the Teamsters. So that they are wise enough now, they've learned something to say that everyone's got to succeed together.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. Courtney, Chris, or do you want to, I'll give you each just the last word. You can have the floor to say whatever you want on this topic or something else, just to get you both your voices in before we say goodbye to everyone.
I mean, on the IATSE topic, I really hope Chris is right and that these guys learn from this experience last summer. I'm a little worried that they haven't. I know, a number of shows that are really cranking to, get it all done before, I think the drop dead date's June 30th or July 31st or so, one of those days. And you need to have it all locked and edited because, IATSE covers editors and everything. And I think if only they could just realize if with negotiation, they don't actually have to worry about that. But, do we learn from our mistakes, as it were? I don't know. We'll see.
Courtney, last word from you. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was just going to answer. There was a question from David Marcus saying any worry that Netflix, et cetera, offshoring, writing, creating mini shows in South Korea and other countries. And I was just going to answer because I'm at Netflix.
Go for it.
I was going to answer that question, which is that Netflix works everywhere. So there's like a million different, like there's Netflix US, there's Netflix UK, there's Netflix in Korea, there's Netflix Africa, there's all these different places, and they all make shows all the time. Netflix as an entity acquires some of those shows. They don't make them themselves. Sometimes they acquire things, but the reason that in part you're seeing more of those on the service right now is because we didn't make anything for 6 months. So if we were on strike and the actors were on strike, there isn't as much US made content, but there isn't a shift in that company specifically to making things other places as much as there is a lot of content that was not affected by the strike outside of this country. And now in order to get us to watch stuff, this is the stuff they got. So just saying I would just unring that alarm bell and say that, you'll get American stuff on that platform soon enough.
Can I add to what you said, Courtney, just because I did a couple of things, because I think that's really a good point. One is, we always said to everybody, if the companies could get away with making things everywhere but here and cheaper, they would. They would have always have done that. They would have done it to begin with. Second thing is, Netflix gets a lot of its content from overseas, but overwhelmingly its engagement is with American-made programming. So Squid Games is obviously a counterexample of that. Elite maybe, and there are a few other things, but the numbers for content made here drive more of their viewership than anything else. So sheer number of programs is not the only and critical metric. The jobs for actors and writers and all that, they're not all going to ship overseas. The fact that we care about each other's content, though, is a good thing also.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us to learn and join the Brown Club of Orange County. Thank you to Chris Kaiser, Chris Ord, and Courtney Kemp, all for giving of their time today to share with all of us. I enjoyed it. I really appreciate it. And I'll turn it over to my father, who I think is going to wrap it up.
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible. Thank you, Todd, for putting together a terrific panel. Thank you very much, Chris Kaiser, Courtney Kemp, and Chris Ord, for a very interesting, stimulating, and informative, as our audience has already recognized. Thanks to everyone who tuned in and who asked some great questions. Thank you to Shauna Schaffner for hosting the Zoom call and coordinating everything. And finally, if you've enjoyed this afternoon's program, you might want to check out the Brown Club of Orange County's website, which is www.browncluboc.org. Thank you and good afternoon.